The day my brother got sworn in as a constable, my father told his entire side of the family that I'd been let go from my government job for incompetence. He said it quietly, the way he always did, leaning toward my aunt with that particular tilt of his head that meant he wanted to be overheard. I was standing 6 feet away holding a paper cup of bad coffee, and I heard every word. I didn't say anything. I never did, not around him, not at family events, not at Christmas dinners, not at the kind of formal ceremonies where you're supposed to smile and take photos and pretend that 20 years of small cruelties never happened. What my father didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that 3 weeks earlier I had been confirmed as a federal Crown prosecutor with the Department of Justice, not a junior associate, not an articling student. A full prosecutor with carriage of serious criminal files, reporting to a director who reported to Ottawa. I was 31 years old, and I had worked for that title since I was 19, in ways my father had never once asked about. But that morning I was just his daughter who had probably wasted her potential. The one who moved away. The one who didn't call enough. My brother's name is Wesley. He's 7 years younger than me. Broad-shouldered and earnest in the way people are when the world has mostly been kind to them. I love him. I want to be clear about that because what happened that day was not about Wesley. It was never about Wesley. He earned his place in that ceremony hall the same way I earned mine in the courtroom. Through years of grinding, unglamorous work, he deserved every second of that afternoon. The ceremony was held at the RCMP Training Division's Regional Convocation Hall in Regina, Saskatchewan. Our family had driven out from Sudbury, a 14-hour trip my father had complained about for the preceding 2 weeks. He'd wanted Wesley to have his ceremony closer to home, as if the RCMP had any obligation to accommodate his driving preferences. My mother had booked a hotel near the venue, a clean, mid-range place on the edge of downtown, and I had flown in the night before from Ottawa, where I'd been living for 4 years. I took a taxi from the airport alone. My parents didn't offer to pick me up. That was fine. I'd stopped expecting things like that a long time ago. I arrived at the hotel at 9:30 in the evening, and my father was in the lobby talking to my uncle, and when he saw me, he looked at me the way people look at a piece of furniture that's been left in the wrong room. Not hostile, just faintly inconvenienced. "You look tired," he said. That was his hello. I told him the flight was fine. He turned back to my uncle. My mother hugged me properly, asked about my apartment, asked if I was eating enough. She is a good woman in many ways and a complicated one in others, and her complicated part has always been that she loves my father more than she is willing to challenge him. She knew, I think, what he said about me to other people. She never corrected it. After a while, I stopped waiting for her to. The next morning was the ceremony. Wesley looked extraordinary in his uniform. I found my seat in the middle section of the hall, near the aisle, which was not a coincidence. I knew the layout. I'd been to 2 RCMP convocations before, years earlier, as a junior legal observer attached to a policy file. I knew where the senior officials would enter from. I knew the protocol. My father and my aunt and my uncle were seated 3 rows ahead of me, slightly to the left. They didn't see me sit down. Wesley's row stood when their names were called. I watched my brother walk to the front of that hall with his shoulders squared and his chin level, and something tightened in my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the drama about to unfold. I was proud of him, pure and simple. It was after the formal presentation, during the reception in the adjoining hall, that my father made his move. He found me near the refreshment table. I was talking to no one in particular, watching the room when he appeared at my elbow with a glass of juice and the expression he always wore when he was about to say something he'd been saving up. "Wesley tells me you're still at that same job," he said. I said I was still with the federal government, yes. Still doing the same thing? The research? The filing? He had decided, years ago, that I worked in some kind of administrative support role. I had never told him what I actually did, partly because he never asked anything specific enough to require a real answer, and partly because, and I know how this sounds, I was protecting something, not my pride, Something more fragile than that. The part of me that still, even at 31, wanted my father to be curious about my life. Wanted him to ask. Wanted the information to matter more because he'd sought it. He never sought it. Something like that, I said. He nodded. He looked around the room. He looked at Wesley, who was across the hall being photographed with his cohort. Your brother always knew what he wanted, my father said. Even as a kid, he had direction. I didn't say anything. I used to worry about you, he continued. You were always in your own world. Books, school, all of that. But school doesn't always translate, does it? It wasn't a question. I heard you had some trouble at work, he said then. Last year. I turned to look at him. Where did you hear that? He shrugged. Your aunt mentioned something. My aunt doesn't know anything about my work. She said you'd been let go from something, a contract. I had been seconded temporarily to a different division, a routine administrative reassignment that my aunt had apparently misinterpreted from a secondhand conversation with my mother, and the story had traveled through the family like a game of telephone until it became a firing. This was not the first time something like this had happened. My family had a long history of converting my silences into narratives that suited them. I wasn't let go from anything, I said. He made a small sound, the kind that means, if you say so. I'm just saying, he said, that it's okay if things haven't worked out the way you planned. You can always come home. There's still time to sort yourself out. 31 years old, federal prosecutor, standing in a convocation hall in Regina, being told there was still time to sort myself out. I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood in the fluorescent light of the bathroom for 2 full minutes, looking at my own face in the mirror. I had learned a long time ago not to cry at these moments. Not because I was strong, I wasn't always strong, but because crying felt like giving my father something, like confirming his assessment, and I refused on some deep and stubborn level to do that. When I came back out, I ran into Deputy Commissioner Harriet Vaux. She was not supposed to be there. Or rather, she was exactly supposed to be there. She had flown in from Ottawa to present citations to 3 members of the graduating cohort, but I hadn't known she would be in attendance, and she hadn't known I would be. We'd worked together 18 months earlier on a joint task force file. The kind of interagency collaboration that puts a junior federal prosecutor in the same room as very senior law enforcement officials, and apparently I had made some impression. Because when she saw me, she stopped. Counsel, she said, and then, when she registered my expression, I was still slightly composed from the bathroom, not entirely back to normal. She said, Are you all right? I told her my brother was one of the constables in the graduating cohort. Her face did something warm and genuine. Which one? I pointed Wesley out. She looked at him, then back at me. Then she smiled, the way people smile when they've just connected 2 pieces of information. Barker, she said. He's a Barker. You're the Barker from the organized crime unit. I said I was. Your director has said extraordinary things about you, she said. The wire authorization file last spring, that was yours? It was mine. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone recalibrating. I recognized it. I'd seen it before, but never in front of my family, and I became aware, in the way you become aware of cold air, that my father had drifted closer. He was not beside me, he was nearby, pretending to examine a framed photograph on the wall, listening. Deputy Commissioner Vaux said something then that I will carry with me for a long time. She said it loudly enough that it wasn't an accident, though I believe she thought it was just normal volume. She had no way of knowing who was in earshot, and no reason to lower her voice. I need to tell your director he's been hoarding you, she said. Organized crime, major fraud. What are you working on now? I told her I had just taken on a carriage file with national security implications. I said it matter-of-factly because that was how we talked in those circles, where extraordinary things are described in ordinary language. Her eyebrows went up. At your level, they gave you carriage? I said they had. She shook her head, but she was smiling. That's not a small thing. That is genuinely not a small thing. My father had stopped pretending to look at the photograph. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Deputy Commissioner Voy, who is now asking about the file in terms that were professional and collegial and completely clear about what kind of lawyer I was and what kind of work I did. We talked for perhaps 4 minutes. She told me to reach out when I was next in Vancouver, that she wanted to discuss a secondment opportunity. She shook my hand. Then she turned to introduce herself to someone else, and I turned, and my father was standing directly behind me. His glass of juice was in his hand. He hadn't drunk any of it. He looked at me the way I had never seen him look at me before. Not angry, not proud, exactly. I want to be careful about that because what was on his face was not quite pride. It was closer to the expression of someone who has just realized they've been reading a map upside down for 20 years. "Who was that?" he asked. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Around us the reception continued. Voices and laughter and the clink of glasses and Wesley somewhere across the room being happy in the way young people are happy when they've just achieved something real. "A national security file," my father said slowly. "Yes." "You're in charge of it." "Yes." He looked down at his juice. He looked up at me. Something was moving across his face that I didn't have a name for and still don't. "I didn't know," he said. "You never asked." It came out without heat. That surprised me. I'd imagined this moment, or versions of it, for years, and in every version I was either cold and controlled or quietly devastated. But standing there, I felt neither of those things. I felt tired, and underneath the tired, something very old and very sore. Like a joint that's been out of alignment for so long, the ache becomes background noise. "I didn't know," he said again, and this time it sounded less like an explanation and more like the beginning of something he didn't know how to finish. I said I knew he didn't. Wesley found us about 10 minutes later, full of energy and wanting to introduce us to his training partner, completely unaware of the small earthquake that had occurred 6 feet from the refreshment table. I let him pull me across the room. I smiled at his training partner. I shook hands with Wesley's supervising officer. I did all of the things you do at your brother's convocation when you love your brother. My father didn't say anything else to me that afternoon. At dinner afterward, a reservation at a steakhouse my mother had booked months in advance. White tablecloths and candles and a 3-course menu. He was quieter than usual. He asked Wesley questions. He refilled my mother's water glass. At one point, when I was talking to my aunt about something unrelated, I felt his eyes on me and I didn't turn around. I flew home the next morning. My mother hugged me at the hotel entrance and held on a beat longer than usual. My father stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets. "Safe flight," he said. "Thanks." I got in the taxi. I watched the hotel disappear behind me and the city flatten out into highway, and I sat with the particular quiet of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something, and then received a version of it that was smaller and stranger than expected. Not the apology I'd rehearsed accepting, not the reckoning I'd sometimes, in my lowest moments, wanted. Just a man on a sidewalk who finally knew what his daughter did for a living and didn't know what to do with that knowledge yet. 3 weeks later, he called me. Not a text, which was how we usually communicated if we communicated at all. He called. I let it ring twice before I answered. He said he'd been thinking about what he'd said at the reception, about me sorting myself out. He said he understood now that had been. He stopped. He started again. He said he'd been wrong about some things. He said it in the flat, effortful way of a man who has not apologized sincerely in a long time and whose mouth doesn't quite know the shape of it. I listened. I didn't feel his silences for him. He said he was proud of me. He said he should have said it a long time ago. He said he wasn't sure why he hadn't and that the not being sure bothered him. I believed him about the last part. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him it mattered, and then I said, carefully and without anger, that the reason he hadn't asked about my work wasn't because I'd hidden it. It was because he'd never been curious. that there was a difference between me keeping secrets and him not asking questions. I said I needed him to understand that distinction before I could know what kind of relationship we were building. He was quiet for a long time. He said he understood. I don't know yet what understanding means for him in practice. I don't know if Sunday calls and genuine curiosity and 20 years of recalibration are something a 63-year-old man from a small city in northern Ontario can actually manage. I'm not holding my breath and I'm not closing the door. I'm doing what I do in the courtroom, which is proceeding on the available evidence and remaining open to revision. What I know is this: I stood in a convocation hall in Regina with bad coffee and a career my father didn't know existed, and I didn't have to say a single word to correct his version of me. The truth corrected it. I just had to wait long enough in the same room for the two things to meet. Wesley texted me later that week. He said our father had called him too, that their conversation had been long and apparently emotional, and that Wesley had come away from it confused but cautiously hopeful. "Do you know what happened at the reception?" Wesley asked. "Not really," I told him. "Did something happen?" "A woman from Ottawa said some nice things about my work," I said. "That's all." There was a pause. Then Wesley sent back a voice note, and in it he was laughing, and then he said, very seriously, that he had always known I was doing something important and that he was sorry he'd never said so out loud. I played that voice note 4 times in my Ottawa apartment, standing in my kitchen in the dark. I am not fixed. My father is not fixed. The things that were said over 20 years don't dissolve because one afternoon in Saskatchewan finally told the truth. But I am standing in a different place than I was. The ground under me feels more like mine than it ever did. That's enough. For now, that's enough. There's something I keep coming back to when I think about that afternoon in Regina. Not the moment Deputy Commissioner Vaux said my name. Not my father's face when he finally understood. What I keep coming back to is the refreshment table. The bad coffee. The paper cup in my hand while my father leaned toward my aunt and quietly dismantled me. I didn't correct him. I'd had years of practice not correcting him, and for a long time I thought that silence was a flaw in me. Some inherited passivity, some failure of nerve. But I've started to think it was something else. I think it was a choice I'd made so many times it had become second nature to let my work speak instead of my mouth. To build something real rather than argue about the perception of it. That's not a virtue I was born with. I learned it the hard way, over years of articling and late nights and files that went nowhere and files that went somewhere important. I learned that the people who shout the loudest about what they deserve are rarely the ones doing the work that earns it. And I learned, slowly, imperfectly, that integrity isn't just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself about what matters and what doesn't. My father's opinion of my career was not, ultimately, something I could afford to let matter more than the career itself. Wesley earned his place in that hall the same way I earned mine. He showed up every day for 2 years and did hard things and didn't quit. That's all any of us can do. The difference between the people who make it and the people who don't isn't talent, usually. It's the willingness to stay in the room when everything in you wants to leave. I stayed in a lot of rooms I wanted to leave. Courtrooms where I wasn't ready. Meetings where I was the youngest person by 15 years. Phone calls from my father where I held the truth in my mouth like a stone and swallowed it. I don't know if what I did was wise or just stubborn, maybe both. But I think there's a kind of intelligence that only gets built through that specific kind of patience. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't ask for recognition, just keeps accumulating evidence until the evidence can't be ignored anymore. Deputy Commissioner Vaux wasn't doing me a favor that afternoon. She was just describing reality. The reality had been there for years. My father simply hadn't looked. What I want, if I'm honest, is not for him to be proud of my title. Titles are just shorthand. What I want is for him to be curious about the person who earned it. That's the thing that was missing for 20 years. Not acknowledgement, but curiosity. The simple act of asking. And maybe that's what I'm watching for now, in these early careful phone calls and these small attempts at something new. Not grand gestures, Just questions. Just the ordinary miracle of a parent wanting to know who their child actually is. That's enough to work with. That's where you start.